sticks, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Trey Orndorff, and I am joined for this midweek supporter exclusive show with Mike. Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Looking forward to getting to some of the stuff that we didn't have the time to talk about on our weekend show.
You know, it's true. This was a packed weekend in some ways, or last weekend was a past weekend in some ways. And one of the big items we really wanted to hit was the U.S.-India maybe trade deal. Let's put a question mark on that. Because this past week, President Trump and Prime Minister Modi announced a reciprocal trade agreement designed to de-escalate a year of intense tariff friction. I know. What tariff friction could we possibly be talking about? But I tease and put that aside for a moment. The agreement is a potential significant tariff reduction in exchange for massive commercial commitments and a shift in India's energy procurement. Now, the United States brings in a total effective tariff rate from 50% right now, if this were to go through, to 18%. That removes the 25% punitive surcharge imposed this past August due to India's purchase of Russian oil. It also includes a $500 billion in purchases of U.S. products, including U.S. oil, Boeing aircraft, other items like this. This gives India a better tariff position than other locations near them, including Vietnam, which are still going to be at a 20% tariff level. Now, the problem, of course, is there is a gap between the words of both of these gentlemen and what seems to be some of the reality on the side. For example, India has argued that it is still going to be protecting their agricultural and dairy sectors, while the Trump and others in D.C. are arguing that it actually removes all non-tariff barriers to its agricultural markets. Trade Representative Greer said that India is going to cut tariffs to zero on, quote, a vast, end quote, amount of agricultural goods, but there could still be carve-out protections in a few key areas. Now, the other area of question among economists is India removing itself from Russia oil. And I know that's where we wanted to spend a lot of time here, Mike, because if India stopped buying Russian crude, it could dramatically change the relationship between those two countries, meaning Russia and India. Russia has already stepped in and argued that India has not made, quote, any statements, end quote, on stopping supplies of oil from Russia. Now, why does Russia care about all this? Well, it's a big deal because while the world has focused on a variety of Trump-created foreign policy moments, the war between Russia and Ukraine has waged on. As has been being reported this past week, Russian forces have suffered casualties of approximately 1.2 million since the Ukraine invasion in 2022. This is according to the Jones and McCabe Center for Strategic and International Studies. Now, the death toll, according to the same individuals, could be as high as 325,000. Cutting off the money to Russia could be a key element, and India is a key player in this. As a matter of fact, the Wall Street Journal was running some editorials and opinion pieces precisely on this topic just this past week. So the India-United States trade deal is important on its own, but it's also important as what it implies for what might be occurring in Russia. So I thought we'd start with that angle, Mike. What are your thoughts?
Well, the first thing is that we don't even know if it's actually going to be a deal. What they agreed to was a framework, and I'll point out that while Trump has talked about India stopping purchases of Russian oil, there's no mention in the joint statement that the U.S. and India released on Friday the 6th, formally announcing the framework about oil or Russia or anything like that. So that said, it certainly could be a big deal. I mean, India has been Russia's second biggest oil customer since Russia invaded Ukraine. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars here. And so absolutely, that's a big deal. India's bought since roughly February 22, which is when Russia invaded, somewhere between 20 to 25% of Russia's total energy exports. Now, that's a lot less than China, which is around 50%, but it's still pretty significant. So while I certainly am not okay with Donald Trump being the tariff king for everything. I, from the beginning, have said I think there are legitimate instances in which national security interests call for or can make certainly legitimate uh, claims on tariffs for those reasons. And certainly, I think buying Russian oil, given what Russia is doing in Ukraine, that to me seems to be a reasonable use of emergency tariff authority as opposed to this kind of larger thing, which, by the way, the Supreme Court still hasn't ruled on yet, probably won't till at least the end of February. So this all could potentially be at least partially academic. We'll see. So everyone's waiting for the Supreme Court to rule on this one.
I think you make some excellent points there on that front. It is, we talk about all the tariffs writ large have been an issue that have sucked up a lot of oxygen in the United States, having conversations about, are we going to invade Greenland? And I think what ends up happening is we haven't spent the time, and by we, I don't mean us personally at the Politics Guys, but I think the global community has lost the space for what really should be a more lasered focus on what's been happening with Russia and Ukraine. Russia remains an important element. And I'm with you here too, right? I mean, on the main show, we talked about how I'm kind of the raging libertarian, and I can't back away from that. That's true. But even I, in that juncture, suggests that having and thinking strategically about how to get countries like Russia to come into the fore using international liberal institutions, and using economic pressures to get Russia to come in is an important one. And it is true, China and previously Europe have been huge reasons that Russia has been able to maintain war efforts as a result of of oil. And that has been a strategic truth. Now, you mentioned the Supreme Court's lack of a decision, but I don't think that's really going to impact things like what we're seeing here with the India trade deal, because we're talking about actually negotiated deals that would be coming through the Senate, it appears, at this juncture.
It's just a framework, and my sense of things is that Donald Trump has no intention of running anything through the Senate on this tariff or any other tariff. So no, I think that the Supreme Court could materially affect that. Come on, Trey. When's the last time you can recall Donald Trump talking about needing Congress to do anything? Are you once again living in some alternate reality or something like that? That's not how it works.
That's fair. Here's the actual empirical reasons I thought this one might be a little bit different. In the past, Trump has not come out and had commentary about these frameworks being reached and advanced. They were just kind of these posts to Truth Social that then took effect as a result of administrative fiat. But in this case, we actually see the two sides. We see both sides saying that we've got a framework. We actually, as a matter of fact, I was even mentioning our trade representative and our ambassador in India being integrate into this conversation with their counterparts. It seems to be a little more like the normal negotiation process that we would expect for everything. Now, you're not wrong. Look, if you're going to take we're rolling up the dice and which way is Trump going to come down on something, I'm with you, right? So I don't want to, you're not wrong about that. But doesn't it appear empirically that this particular agreement with India has taken shape differently, has been announced differently, and has been pursued differently than, say, when we were going to have the global Make America Great Again tariffs that just came out in this kind of big press conference, totally in the United States and primarily on True Social before we had these television moments for it?
Well, I guess in part, and I think that's in part because the EU recently negotiated a big trade agreement with India, and Trump didn't want to be kind of left behind on that thing. But again, like with anything Trump related, it's a lot more hype than reality. For instance, they've been pushing about how, well, India says India will buy $500 billion worth of U.S. products. If you actually look at the framework, it says they intend to do that over 5 years. And an intent is not necessarily legally binding anything. It's like, no. I may intend to go for a 5-mile run, but come on, the reality of the situation is that I might make it to the end of my driveway and say, the hell with this. So, it's, I think also that the EU part is important because actually the third largest consumer of Russian energy is the European Union, largely through natural gas. They have those pipelines and so forth. Now, they've tried to minimize their reliance on that, but it's still pretty significant. They've done, kind of a good job. But I guess when I think about the extent to which this is going to hurt Russia's war effort, I feel like a little bit, but what we need to look at isn't just Russia's situation. And things don't look great for Russia economically. Stagnating growth, high inflation, the sort of amount of fiscal slack they've had since the invasion of Ukraine has gotten less and less, in large part because of widespread sanctions and the cost of the war. But the question isn't what shape Russia's in, it's what shape it is in relative to Ukraine. And when you look at it through that lens, well, Ukraine is basically now a donor-financed state under constant attack. And so Russia, even with India curtailing its oil purchases, which we don't even know if that's going to happen at this point, because again, nothing about that was mentioned in the agreement. Well, Russia can plausibly keep on going for at least a few more years. And can Ukraine? Well, as long as the West keeps on financing Ukraine, yes. But if it doesn't, then no. And so, there's a lot that's really up in the air about this. And so to me, and you mentioned your libertarian kind of priors on all this stuff, I think it's important to keep in mind that before Liberation Day, as Trump called it, the U.S. tariff on India was somewhere between 2 and 2.5%. So going down to 18 it seems like a win, but come on, it's really a huge loss for free trade.
Look, aren't you excited about the upcoming Trump checks that are coming as rebates for all the winning that we've been doing on those 18% tariffs, 25%, 30%
There were,
tariffs?
it reminds me, there's this place back in, I don't know if they're still in business, called Men's Warehouse. They used to have cheesy ads on TV. And once or twice I went in there because I am not one of the rich and well off. So, every once in a while I needed to get like a jacket or something. And I remember all their prices, like their list prices were like, this suit coat is $500, but we're cutting it by 78% or something, which, it feels like it's the same sort of bait and switchy kind of stuff with the Trump administration. It's just shifty kind of marketing type of stuff. And I just can't wait for the Supreme Court to rule on this because I have great confidence that they will significantly curtail his tariff authority. And by God, Congress sure isn't going to do that, because if you took all the Republicans in Congress and put them together, maybe between them you could build one spine, but that would be about it.
It is unfortunate. I was thinking about this in a broader context, but it is true. What the framers separated, parties united. And as a result, we do see the idea that the institutional jealousies would overcome party outcomes has nowhere been more demonstrated wrong than in, say, the last 10, 15 years. Not that it wasn't happening before, but even more so. And this is just a kind of a key example of this. In what other universe? At first, when you were talking about we get all the Republicans together, would they be willing to have this kind of trade barriers? Well, I thought you were going to say, but I think the answer would also be no. And that takes to your point about the lack of a spine. There is no universe. There is zero universe in which Republicans would have gotten together and put the kind of so-called Liberation Day tariffs around the world. That was not at all part of the Republican ethos. It's not at all a part of the Republican platform. And I mean, besides just being bad economic policy, but let's just put that aside and say you're just being purely ideological. It wasn't the ideological position of Republicans, but even on that one, they're not willing to push back because of the party connections, and the president in power ends up being the head of the party. It's the de facto truth of the matter. But you're not wrong. And it's hard for me to not see the current international increasing amount of tension and violence as a complete corollary to the fact that we have increased we've decreased economic interdependence, and as a result, it results in more tensions and the higher possibility for conflict. I mean, again, that seems like just kind of international relations 101. I think my freshman's taking IR 101 right now are going to be able to come to that conclusion pretty quick. And yet here we are, like you rightfully mentioned, saying, woohoo, we're down to 18, which is more than a 10% increase or a tenfold increase.
Yeah, exactly. Now, of course, the flip side of the increased interdependence is then it can be more difficult to push back against. I mean, we talked about Europe still needing so much Russian energy. And there's a case where interdependence actually came back to bite Europe because it takes time to unwind from that sort of thing. And so when you're dealing with an authoritarian and non-democratic regime, especially, that can sometimes be a negative. And for too long, I think there were a lot of folks who were relying on cheap Russian energy. And certainly this has worked out really well for China because they've been able to buy a lot of cut rate Russian energy, in the wake of this.
Well, and this is where I think the academia has really has been ahead of what's happening policy-wise, right? Initially, there was a thought that internationally, as we increased interdependence, that would create more democratic states. But the evidence as time moved on suggested that was not the case. So the actual answer, if you want to be the most empirical about it, and Europe is a great example of this, is 100% we should have low to no tariff barriers with fellow democratic countries, and we should try to have deep increases with them. However, the idea that making those connections with Russia or China or fill in whoever's going to be your authoritarian regime is going to change their regime has been demonstrated wrong. That's the evidence. What it does is it enhances their position as their wealth increases. And so I think that was the fundamental mistake. We need to have open interdependence with fellow democracies, and we need to we don't need to have military I don't mean isolating in that sense, but we need to recognize that we shouldn't have that kind of interdependence with a Russia for this very reason. And that's what we're seeing here. And as a matter of fact, in Europe, for example, one of the prime reasons they have this interdependence with Russia was weirdly kind of a left-wing move in Germany that said, well, we don't want to have kind of safe nuclear power. Let's get rid of nuclear power. Well, thank you, friends. Now you're dependent on Russia. Here would be an example of where I think a number of actually bad empirical policies led to some unfortunate outcomes. Now, I recognize, 30 years ago, we had that thought, but that the evidence has moved forward.
Yeah, definitely. I certainly agree. And I've been a long-time advocate for a lot more nuclear as in part of the alternative non-fossil fuel energy mix. And I think that was a huge mistake in Germany and maybe other parts of Europe to a lesser extent, led largely by kind of far left or leftist sort of elements, essentially. Yeah.
We'll be back with one of our regular episodes this weekend. I hope you'll join us then. I have to end us right there because that's the end of the ad-supported preview of the Politics Guys Supporters Exclusive Midweek Show. Now, there's always so much more, and I'd love to share it with you, but it's exclusive to supporters. So head to the show notes right now and become a supporter of the Politics Guys, and that's going to get you access to the rest of this episode. Now, you can also support the show in a variety of other ways. You can head to politicsguys.com/support. You can also head to patreon.com/politicsguys. Now, no matter how you do it, it just takes a couple of minutes and you're going to get instant access to this show, but also so much more. Our midweek shows, our ongoing series. So, for example, Justin and myself are going through political ideologies, and you'll get the rest of that show, plus our entire back catalog. Ken and I are going through the Federalist Papers. And in addition, you'll get access to my Substack on the Federalist Papers. So there's just so much content for supporters that we're kind of bursting at the seams. You can even chat with us on Discord. So to become a supporter, again, just head to the show notes, click there, or head to politicsguys.com/support and become a supporter today. Now, if you're not in a financial position to do that today, we understand that. You can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com for that or any other reason, and we would love to make that a possibility for you as well. It's also really important that you subscribe, rate, and review the Politics Guys. We need those algorithms. One of the best things you can do is share this episode with people you know and think would appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to stop there and stop on a really important note. That is with our incredible executive producers. These have been with us for a long time, and I deeply appreciate all of you. They are Wilma Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Miller. We'll be back with a full episode this weekend. I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,